Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Alessandra Tanesini, and I am one of the co-PIs for a project entitled, this is a bit of a mouthful, Using Values to Increase Intellectual Humility among Political Partisans. The other co-PI is Greg Mayo, who is also here, and we are grateful to Georgia State University and the Templeton Foundation for giving us the funds that make this possible. This talk is going to be recorded, and we will send out an email once the recording is up for people to view if they want to. We are very honored today to have Tenelle Porter, who is an assistant professor at Rowan University. She is a developmental psychologist, and she has published extensively about intellectual humility and education. And her talk today is entitled Investigating the Effects of Teachers' Intellectual Humility on Students' Interest and Learning. So thanks, Tenelle. Please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I'm going to share my screen. Hello from the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection, Philadelphia. Thank you for being here. I want to begin by sharing a clip from an interview that I conducted with a student about a year ago. Here, this is a college undergraduate talking about her experience in introductory proofs, so an introductory math class in college.
The reason I ended up dropping it was because when I took it that initial time, there was a kid in my class who was like really good, like ridiculously good at it already. And like, I wasn't really sure why he was taking an intro proofs course, but that kid already knew all like the symbols and like the for all, like if not, all those symbols, and he like knew what a contrapositive was already. And then like on the first day of class, the teacher was like, okay, we'll do a practice proof of like proving that like the Pythagorean theorem or something like that. I forget like the exact details, or like square root of 2, something like that. And this kid, he like clearly already knew the proof, like had read it somewhere. And so then he was like, oh, I can do this one. And he like went up and did the proof. But like as somebody who's like just doing proofs for the first time, if you encounter that, like obviously nobody's really gonna know how to do it like right off the bat unless you're like Isaac Newton or something. But then since he did do it right off the bat, I was like, oh, everybody in this class is like Isaac Newton or something. Like why am I the only one who didn't know how to do that?
So there is a lot that we could unpack here. That's sort of a rich case. But I want to share with you that the student who was a math major and very skilled and able in math ended up changing her major from math to something else. In large part, she attributed it to this experience in this intro proofs class. And this is something that I was hearing again and again from students, that this notion that it's hard not to know things in a class. What is it about our classrooms that are making it hard not to know things? In a survey of 1,400 students, just to put like a finer point on this, in a large scale survey of adolescents, 40% of them said that they regularly struggled to admit it if they were confused or didn't understand something in class. So this isn't just something that's happening to 1 or 2 students every now and then. This is a common experience in classrooms. Girls reported struggling with this more than boys. They were less comfortable revealing it if they didn't know something or disclosing that to others. And struggles were most common in math classes. So looking at all this, it just makes me wonder what is happening in our classrooms that make them spaces where it's hard not to know things. This is sort of an ironic feature of classrooms because we are in school to learn, and like the endeavor of school, the whole enterprise is about learning something that you didn't know before. And yet we're creating these spaces where it's hard not to know. You feel like you should already know, and it's hard to get the help that you need if you don't know something. So a real motivating question that undergirds the work that I am going to share is just how can we help students reveal gaps in their understanding? How can we make these spaces where it's easier not to know so that students can take advantage of the social learning opportunities that they have in school to learn as much as they can? So that question is foundational to the work. It's a real motivating question that gives life to the work that I'm sharing with you today. But I want to begin before I get into sharing the data with you, I want to tell you a little bit about how I think of this as relating to intellectual humility. So this won't come as a surprise to many of the folks on the Zoom call, but intellectual humility has been defined in many, many different ways. Scholars don't agree about what it is, but if we look across all of the definitions and accounts, many people talk about it as involving this element of owning our intellectual limitations. The language of owning comes from the Whitcomb and colleagues' philosophical account of intellectual humility. Well, what does it mean to own our intellectual limitations? Well, on one hand, it involves a cognitive experience. We are aware that we don't know something. We're aware that we don't know everything there is to know. We're aware that we might be wrong about things. So these are things that are happening in our heads. And it also involves this behavioral expression so that we match what's happening in our heads with how we're behaving. So an intellectually humble person, when they don't know something, doesn't pretend to know it, or when they make a mistake, they don't deny that they made a mistake or got something wrong. They admit it and they reveal that they don't know and don't understand. And yet when we think about, something that really interests me is where that cognitive experience of intellectual humility and the behavioral expression of it may come apart. So if we think about a student in a classroom and they are experiencing a lot of intellectual humility, like the student from our clip, she doesn't know how to do this proof. And they kind of look around the classroom and see that other people are understanding something that they don't understand. They may begin to wonder, do I really belong here? The experience of intellectual humility can kind of set off a lot of other questions in a student's mind in a classroom. And then when they think about like voicing the fact that they don't understand something or admitting it, they may begin to wonder, what are other people going to think about me if I do that? In particular, disclosing that might be especially hard for students who are negatively stereotyped, whose competence is negatively stereotyped in a particular domain. We wondered, though, what would happen if we took a student like this and put them in a classroom with a teacher who had taken the first step to reveal their intellectual limitations. What might the effect of that teacher's intellectual humility be on students? I was curious about this, and so I started reading and looking into the research that we have on teacher practices, and we have a lot of really rich frameworks about how teachers can promote positive motivation. You may have heard terms like mastery-oriented or growth mindset teaching practices, positive error climates. What's notable about these is that they are really good at helping teachers respond adaptively to students' errors. But none of the frameworks, insofar as I could tell, helped teachers grapple with or address how they might respond to their own intellectual limitations in a setting. Moreover, if we look at research on intellectual humility, the empirical research that we have, most of it has focused on how intellectual humility might benefit an individual. So we see if I'm intellectually humble, it helps me in X, Y, and Z way. But there's less work examining or even exploring or asking how one person's intellectual humility might benefit someone else. So all of these wonderings came together to coalesce into kind of research question that was like, can a teacher's intellectual humility benefit students? And if it can, how might it benefit students? What is the psychological process through which it might work? And then furthermore, if we see evidence that it can benefit students in a laboratory setting, what then happens when we look at a real classroom? Might it have disproportionate benefits? Might it benefit some students more than others? And would there be any benefits of the teacher's intellectual humility on students' actual achievement in school? So the talk today is going to move in this order, proceeding from the first question to the second to the third, and how we investigated and looked into these. So beginning with the first question, I'm actually going to pull up, there we go. I was not able to see anybody's faces, and I would like to see that I'm not just talking into the void. Now I've remedied that problem. So beginning with the first question, can teachers' intellectual humility benefit students? I want to share a little bit about how we looked at that. So we ran some experiments. These were online experiments in which students were logged into the computer, both undergraduates and high school students, and we showed them a picture of a teacher. We gave them a description of the teacher. This is the class that he teaches. This is his name. These are his credentials. And underneath this picture, we showed students a letter from this teacher to prospective students. And I will say, for those on the call paying attention, that this photo is of my spouse, who gamely agreed to be a model for this research. So I have to acknowledge and thank him in every single talk. So anyway, everyone saw this in the letter to prospective students, and that now is where the experiment began. We randomly assigned students to see one of 3 letters. In one of the letters, the teacher models intellectual humility. He says, there are many ways to solve math problems. If you have a different approach, I can learn from your way of doing things. Math is extensive. Even I don't know everything there is to know about math. And we're all human rather. We can learn from one another's errors. I'll try to avoid it, but I will make errors. And when I do, I'll admit those to you. We had a second condition where the teacher did not model intellectual humility in his letter, but he recommended that students have intellectual humility. So he said things like, if I have a different approach than you, you can learn from my way of doing things, and math is extensive. Like, you should know, you don't know everything there is to know about math. And when you make errors, go ahead and admit those, because those are a chance for you to learn from one another. And then finally, we had a third condition that was just neutral. It didn't mention anything about intellectual humility at all. So what happened? The first thing we wanted to know was whether the students were picking up on the fact that the humble teacher was actually humbler than the other condition. So we asked them, how much does the teacher you read about believe that they can learn from their students, etc.? And what I'm graphing here are the standardized mean differences between the active experimental conditions and the control condition. So what we see is that the students in the modeling condition reported that teacher as being, 3/4 of a standard deviation more humble than the control condition. And we didn't see that effect in the recommending condition. So that is a long way of saying we had confidence that the manipulation was successful. We then said, okay, you read about this teacher. Imagine that you enrolled in his class. How comfortable do you think you would be sharing with other students if you were confused, or admitting in this class that you didn't know something? Here again, we saw that students thought they would be most comfortable doing that when the teacher had modeled intellectual humility relative to both the control and the recommending conditions. And then we asked, how interested would you be in taking this class? And again, students were most interested in the class when the teacher modeled intellectual humility. So you know, can teachers' intellectual humility benefit students? Like, maybe, but we had set up a particular situation here where we told students, this is a teacher who has a PhD from Stanford and they've taught this class for 7 years and they're obviously very handsome and etc. It's possible that if we didn't show the teacher and we didn't show their credentials, we didn't highlight any credentials, that when the students saw the teacher saying things like, I don't know everything there is to know about math, they might have just concluded that they had nothing to learn from this teacher. So we wanted to see, would these effects replicate if we didn't highlight the teacher's credentials? So we ran a study looking at that. This was an online experiment with undergraduates. Instead of highlighting the credentials, we just showed this chalkboard with the creepy math symbols on it, and then we had the letter to prospective students that had the exact same conditions as before, the modeling, intellectual humility, recommending, and control. To summarize here, basically we've found the results replicated. These are the effect sizes for the modeling intellectual humility condition. Even when the teacher's credentials were not highlighted, students were more willing to express intellectual humility and more interested in the class relative to the control and the recommending humility condition. So we had some evidence here that teachers' intellectual humility might be able to benefit students, but we wondered more about the psychological process. How is this happening? So we ran another experiment, this time with around 500 undergraduates. Just to give you a quick recap, again, here we saw that the manipulation was successful. Students were picking up on the fact that the humble teacher was humbler than the others. They were more comfortable expressing intellectual humility when the teacher modeled humility. They were more interested in the class when the teacher modeled humility. So the question for us was how, or like why, was the teacher's modeling of humility affecting these dependent variables? We hypothesized there could be a role here for something to do with warmth, the warmth that the teacher is conveying. So we thought maybe the teacher's expression of intellectual humility was communicating to students that they would be accepted by the teacher and also that they would fit in among their peers in that class, because the teacher is the one who sets the tone for the class. We also thought maybe there could be some process going on with ideas of competence and what the teacher is communicating about what it means to be a competent student in this classroom. So when the teacher says, I don't know everything, I'm an expert and I don't know everything there is to know about math, maybe it's reducing these field-specific ability beliefs, or this idea that to succeed in this class, you have to be like Isaac Newton. You have to basically be sort of like a genius. Maybe we thought the teacher's intellectual humility could be reducing a belief that failure or mistakes hurt learning. And we thought potentially that the teacher's expression of intellectual humility could be conveying to students that their own math intelligence isn't fixed, but that they can get smarter and grow more intelligent in math over the course of the class. So we tested, these are 5 mediators. We tested them in a robust parallel mediation analysis that tested all of them at the same time. What we found is, as predicted, in the modeling intellectual humility condition, students felt more accepted by their professor. They predicted that they would feel a stronger sense of belonging with peers. They reported that they'd feel less like you had to be a genius to do well in this class. They felt less like belief. They felt less like failure would be totally debilitating in this class, but we didn't really see a strong link between modeling intellectual humility and students' mindsets or beliefs about the malleability of their math ability. And then when we looked at our dependent variable and kind of how those mediators were predicting the outcome of students' willingness to express intellectual humility, we found a large role for warmth. So we found that the teacher's intellectual humility was increasing this sense that students would be accepted by the professor, and even more so that they would fit in with their peers. And this was doing the bulk of the work in explaining why they would feel more comfortable in that class, expressing intellectual humility themselves. Similarly, when we looked at the variable of interest, we found that this was primarily working through a sense of acceptance with the professor. So students were more interested in taking the class primarily because they felt that they would be more accepted by the professor. So we've explored this issue, this question of how might teachers' intellectual humility benefit students. All of the studies that I've shared with you so far have taken place in a kind of artificial setting, in a laboratory setting. Those settings are wonderful in that they allow us to experimentally manipulate things and get like causal data. And yet we were curious about whether we would see any of the effects replicating if we moved into a real classroom setting and had students reporting about their actual teachers. We also wondered, in a real classroom, would benefits be disproportionately larger for some students as compared to others? And whether, all of these variables that we had been looking at, from the teacher's intellectual humility to the students, comfort asking questions and expressing intellectual humility themselves, whether those might relate to an objective measure of learning, which is students' actual grades. So we conducted another study. This time we worked with Character Lab to recruit about 400 high school students. We surveyed students at the beginning of the marking period. Well, I'm thinking back to this. Yes, so we surveyed students at the beginning of the marking period, but they had been with the teacher now for a different marking period. So they kind of, so it's like mid-fall. So they sort of knew their teacher. And we gave them a description of an intellectually humble teacher that said, this is a teacher who owns up to their mistakes, reveals that they still have things to learn, even about their subject, shows that they're open to different ways of doing things. If you have a different approach, they try to understand where you're coming from. And then we ask students to rate how well does this description fit your current English, math, social studies, and science teacher. So all of their core subject teachers. We were then able to nest students' ratings of their teacher within student in a multi-level model and see what happened. So at a high level, what we are seeing in these data is that the more students perceive their teacher to be intellectually humble, the more willing they are to express intellectual humility in that teacher's classroom, the greater their sense of acceptance with that teacher is, and the more interested they are in that teacher's class. So we saw replication in this real context of the effects that we were seeing in the lab setting. We found, moreover, that the effects of the teacher expressing intellectual humility seem to benefit girls most. So in this graph, boys are represented by the blue line, and girls are represented by the green line. We have teacher intellectual humility along the x-axis here, so along the bottom, and students' comfort expressing intellectual humility across the y-axis. So what you can see is that for like the left half of this graph in the middle, boys are higher than girls in their comfort expressing intellectual humility. And we see that in our studies, in study after study, that girls will report that their average comfort disclosing what they don't know in a classroom tends to be lower than boys. But as the teacher's intellectual humility gets higher, the gap between boys and girls closes such that it's completely eliminated. So it's suggesting that teachers' intellectual humility could potentially foster this kind of engagement in the classroom and also increase equity of engagement in the classroom. Was there any link between all of these variables and students' actual grades? Well, we did see some links. So I told you we measured students' perceptions of their teacher and these other variables at the beginning of the second marking period, but we measured GPA at the end of the second marking period. So we have some distance here between the assessment of perceptions and measures and their grades. And we see a positive association between perceptions of teacher humility, students' willingness to express humility, sense of acceptance by the teacher, and interest in predicting grades. And these associations remain even when we control for students' baseline grades. So it's not just like higher achieving students seeing and doing all of these things as because they're higher achieving. We're actually seeing that when we equate everyone on where they are in achievement at the start, we still see some predictive value of these variables. So we wondered how all three of the variables, or all four of the variables, might be working together to shape GPA. And what we can see hinted in these data is a hint of a process potentially, where the teacher's intellectual humility is fostering, potentially encouraging students to voice their own questions. It's encouraging this positive relationship with the teacher, the sense of that they're accepted by the teacher. It's increasing their own interest in the class. And these variables in turn are predicting grades over time, and even changes in grades over time. So there's an indirect effect of the teacher's intellectual humility on students' changes in grades via these other mediating variables. So to just kind of recap and wrap up what I've shown, we have some evidence here, at least from these studies that we've conducted, that the teacher's intellectual humility can benefit students. These benefits seem to be working, seem to occur because the teacher's intellectual humility increases students' sense of acceptance and belonging in the classroom. It is also decreasing the belief that failure or mistakes are harmful to learning. And the teacher's intellectual humility might benefit girls most and may increase achievement by increasing students' willingness to express intellectual humility themselves, their sense of acceptance, and their interest in the class. I want to thank my wonderful collaborators, Andre Simpian and Mark Leary, who worked with me on this. Of course, Character Lab and the Templeton Foundation for their support. You have my Gmail there. Feel free to send me any questions later, or we can take questions now. I'll go ahead and stop the share. Thanks. Cheers. I'm happy to take any questions or just to chat about this work or how you see it relating.
So do we want to start with the questions now, or do people want a 3-minute break and we'll start again at 5 minutes past? I'm happy either way.